this one forward and back.
Yeah. Thank you all. I'd like to start with thanking the organizers for their invitation to attend this program. It's actually an honor, privilege to be in this program where Tony Leggett is being honored on his 80th birthday. So let me, first of all, wish a happy birthday and all the very best for many more years to come. I would like to talk about some work that we have been doing off and on over the last maybe 8 or 10 years. This is actually not my sort of usual line of research, but I thought it would be appropriate to talk about this work here because, as Professor Bhaskaran had pointed out sometime in his lecture, this supersolid, the many sort of seminal work, or the fact that supersolid behavior can actually exist in helium and other quantum crystals, was actually brought into the sort of consciousness of researchers in this area by Professor Leggett. So this is one of the early papers that Bhaskaran alluded to, that was in 1970, where this issue of whether some quantum solids, while they're in the solid state, in the crystalline state, can also have superfluidity, and that is precisely what one means by supersolid, whether that can exist, etc., and what would be the properties of that state. These things were worked out by Tony Leggett many years ago, 50 years ago. Roughly 50 years ago. And then the subject was not actually, didn't receive a great deal of attention, but then it became very popular maybe about 10, 12 years ago, when there were some experiments from Penn State, from the lab of Moses Chan, which somehow seemed to indicate that solid helium-4 under certain circumstances would actually exhibit this superfluidity behavior. And at that point, there were many people who got interested in this and started doing some work. And in some sense, we also got involved with this problem at that time. So let me just mention that this work is done in collaboration with my long-term collaborator, Oriol, who is in University of Minnesota. One of his students got involved in this process, and this work that I'm going to talk about formed part of his thesis. And this collaboration was supported by the US-India Science and Technology Forum. Several papers came out of this. So this is basically the people who are involved. Start with a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. So again, since time is short, I'll give a very brief introduction to some experimental observations and a few theoretical ideas, and then depending on how much time is left, I'll talk about two different calculations that we have done. One is considering a two-dimensional bosonic solid and looking at whether one can have superfluidity in such a system arising from superfluidity in defects, extended defects like grain boundaries. This one is dealing with dislocation lines and superfluidity arising from that, and what effect that the motion of a dislocation line have on the superfluidity. So introduction again, as I said, the idea of having supersolidity was introduced among other people by Tony Leggett many years ago, and this subject got a lot of attention around this time, which is about 14, 15 years ago, when Kim and Chan, they presented some experimental data, which they claimed, many people other also sort of believed their claim, that this shows that if we look at solid helium-4, this is the phase diagram, so to speak. There is a superfluidity, of course, helium. This is the phase diagram of helium. This line is what they proposed, that in the solid phase, there are these two different phases. One is normal solid, and the other is supersolid, which shows this non-classical rotational inertia. This is basically when you have a superfluid component that, of course, does not respond to this kind of rotation that one has basically in this oscillator experiments. And so the effective rotational inertia becomes less than what one would expect, and that is called the non-classical rotational inertia fraction. And Kim and Chan claimed that the experiments show that depending on systems and samples and so on and so forth, there is a temperature below which one has a non-zero value of this non-classical rotational inertia, and this was interpreted as this transition from a normal solid to a supersolid. There were many other experiments. Well, this is just a slide to show what this torsional oscillator actually looks like. This is John Reppy, who then repeated many of these experiments. And here you have this picture where you have this helium contained in here, and then one has a rotational torsional oscillation. One looks at resonance, and from the frequency, one can calculate what the rotational inertia is. And when one finds that it is less than what it should be minimally, then that is an evidence for non-classical rotational inertia. Other experiments involving also showed some signs of mass flow through solid helium, etc., etc. I don't want to go into details, but these experiments again were repeated in many different labs. There was lots of controversy also, and then a lot of people got trying to understand what is going on. And there was also theoretical work which basically involved quantum Monte Carlo simulations of helium. And the review article, which shows that this commensurate crystal of helium is unlikely to exhibit superfluidity. And also this superfluidity arising from vacancies in interstitials, those are also unlikely to happen if you just look at the parameters which correspond to interactions, etc., between helium atoms. But these people also showed, or several other people also showed, that in this helium, actually one can get superfluidity, not when the crystal is a perfect crystal, but every crystal typically will have some defects, and the defects could be dislocations, grain boundaries, and so on. And there are evidence from quantum Monte Carlo simulations saying that along grain boundaries and dislocation lines in helium-4, there could be superfluidity. So this is an alternative mechanism for supersolid behavior, in the sense that you have a solid which is not a perfect crystal, which has this crystalline defects, and you have the superfluid component which is basically existing along these defects. And then one can try to look at the properties of such a system and then see whether that can show this non-classical rotational inertia and so on and so forth. So that is the thing that we tried to do. And before going further, I should mention that this claim that these experiments that Kim and Chan did represent supersolid behavior actually has now been withdrawn. The same Moses Chan, a different Kim, not the same Kim, but later on they again wrote another paper, this is 2012, saying that the results that they found most likely are not reflecting supersolid behavior. There are some interesting things there, but those things are typically supposed to be associated with the elastic effects arising from softening of dislocation lines and so on and so forth. Pinning of dislocation lines, which may produce similar effects, because again you are looking at the elastic properties of the helium that is there in your torsional oscillation cell, that will to some extent depend, to some extent be involved in determining the rotational frequency and so on and so forth. So the general community belief in this is that at least there is no clear evidence for having this supersolid behavior in helium. But what is interesting is that around the same time or a little year before that, there are many reports in very fancy journals and so on, where in this called ultra-cold atomic systems, people are finding evidence for different kinds of supersolid behavior. So in general, this problem still exists, and although in solid helium, under the circumstances that have been studied, it is unlikely that one is seeing supersolid behavior. One may continue to investigate this, at least theoretically, which is what we did. Okay, so this is basically the background. So the first calculation that we did was basically for a system of two-dimensional bosonic, two-dimensional bosons, and what we tried to show was that if I now look at this two-dimensional system of bosons under appropriate parameters such that the system is in a solid state, solid meaning it's a two-dimensional solid, but it's not a perfect solid, it has grain boundaries, then that system actually can exhibit behavior similar to what one observed in the experiments on helium. That can also show this non-classical rotational inertia function under certain circumstances. And actually this work was, we did this work, one of the reasons of course when this was people who were very much interested in these sort of things at that time. But at that time also we were looking at a different system, which is basically a system of vortex lines in superconductors, high temperature superconductors. And we were, again, that's another system that a lot of people have studied, both experimentally and theoretically, and many different kinds of vortex phases have been found on those systems. And we tried to make an analogy between that system and this two-dimensional system of bosons. So let me just spend one or two transparencies on that relationship. So here, what one is looking at is a cartoon of that. One is looking at a superconductor in the magnetic field, type 2 superconductor. So the field partially enters into the system in the form of these vortex lines. Vortex lines will go in that direction, in the z direction, in which direction the magnetic field is applied. And there could be pinning. There could be disorder coming from pinning centers. So if I want to write down the sort of Hamiltonian for this system of vortex lines, each vortex line is going to be characterized by position of the jth vortex line at slice z. Z is this direction. And then you have this line term which is associated with the energy per unit length of the vortex lines. Then there is an interaction between the vortex lines. And then, of course, the interaction of the vortex lines with pinning potential. So this is typically the kind of description that one uses to describe the statistical mechanics of this collection of vortex lines. Now, it was pointed out by Nelson and Winokur, and of course, I mean, this is something that also was known earlier, but in this particular context, they made a very good mapping of this to a system of two-dimensional bosons. And the partition function of, let's say, system of two-dimensional bosons at temperature T sub B, again, can be written in this particular way. This is sort of the kinetic energy term. This is the interaction term among the bosons. And the bosons can also interact with disorder field associated with pinning. And here, the pinning has to be columnar in the sense that in the previous picture, the pinning potential was independent of Z. And that's possible when the pinning is not due to point pinning, but due to columnar pinning, which is running parallel to the vortex lines. So that makes, in this Hamiltonian, when I want to do the mapping, the potential to be independent of this variable, time variable. So basically, then, if I can understand the statistical mechanics of this set of vortex lines in the presence of pinning, then from that I can infer certain things about the behavior of these two-dimensional bosons, also in the presence of some pinning potential. Of course, the interaction potential that is here between the bosons is the same as the interaction between vortex lines that you have in this superconductor, which is basically logarithmic at short distances, and then at long distances it falls off exponentially. And the mapping is that the temperature in this vortex system, actually, see here you have 1 over h bar. In the vortex system is 1 over kBt. So temperature is like the h bar. The energy per unit length is like particle mass. And we'll be talking about the limit where the vortex system has infinite extent in the direction of the magnetic field. This is like a zero temperature limit of the boson problem. So the question is then, I mean, this is just mapping one problem onto the other. The question is what we can say about either one of these two problems. And there, the work that I was, first of all, let me just talk about 1 or 2 experimental results for this vortex system, which is again, very extensive experimental work was done to understand the behavior of these systems. And there, this is theoretical picture that in this vortex system, in the presence of columnar pinning, there could be 2 phases. One is a Bose glass phase, which is like a solid, and one is a flux liquid, which is like a superfluid. So, and people have studied this Bose glass phase very closely in various experiments. And what one finds is that the Bose glass phase with columnar pinning basically has a polycrystalline structure. There are regions where the vortices form nice crystalline lattice, like the ablicus of lattice, but because of this spinning, the disorder, this ablicus of lattice breaks up, and one basically has a polycrystalline structure with grain boundaries. So basically, this is what is known experimentally. Further experiments have shown that, so this is what I just mentioned, that within this Bose glass phase, there is a region where one has something which is called vortex nanoliquid, which basically says that there is spatial inhomogeneity, that there are regions where the vortex lines are behaving as if they're in a liquid state, and then they are surrounded by regions where the vortex lines basically look like as if they are in a crystalline state. And this vortex nanoliquid then means that experimentally one has seen in this system coexistence of solid and liquid-like regions, and this where this liquid-like region is actually coming from, that was not understood from these experiments as such, but then the modeling, etc., that we did told us that we have this polycrystalline state. Polycrystalline state has these grain boundaries, and near the grain boundaries you have liquid-like regions. One has some kind of a melting near the grain boundaries. Although the whole system is solid, wherever you have this grain boundary, there you have a region where the system behaves as if it's a liquid state. So that is, in some sense, if I now go back to the boson analogy, that will say that you have a phase where, since the vortex liquid corresponds to the superfluid phase in the boson analogy. So you have superfluidity, but it is not throughout the whole system, but it is in these grain boundaries, which is basically where you have crystallites of different orientation meeting each other. So these are this is what the work that we are doing on the vortex system, and it was published again some time ago. But we had the results from which we could see that it's a Bose-Glass phase. There's a polycrystalline structure. You can see here then there is a big crystallite, and then there are other smaller crystallites separated from it by these grain boundaries. And one could see that the vortices which are near these grain boundaries, they behave like a liquid as compared to the vortices which are in the middle of this crystalline regions.
So what is the definition of a liquid here?
In this case, one basically looks at the mobility of the vortices which are in that region. How far they, let's say, I mean, whether you have diffusion or whether you have basically localized behavior.
But it's a very small region, so what is diffusion?
Right. So it's not a very small region. There are maybe, there are 20, 30 vortices along each line. But one can look at basically in this calculation. I have not given you the details of this calculation. One gets something that is called the local Debye-Waller factor. Basically, we look at the average position, and then you look at fluctuations about that position, and you have basically some kind of a Gaussian density, and the width of that Gaussian density profile gives you some degree of localization. Somewhat similar to this Lindemann criterion that one uses to sort of distinguish between a solid and a liquid. So now we have a very good picture of what is going on. We have a situation where you have a polycrystalline, in that, let's say, if I'm talking about the two-dimensional bosonic system, you have a situation where you have polycrystalline at 0 temperature, a polycrystalline structure, and then there will be grain boundaries, and near the grain boundaries, localized near the grain boundaries, you could have this superfluidity. And then the question is whether for such a system, one would see the behavior that one finds in this torsional oscillation experiments, the non-classical rotational inertia, to what extent that can be seen in such a system. So again, this is Bose-Glass phase. Then one can ask, what is the vortex liquid phase? Liquid phase is the other way around, where it's mostly liquid, but there are very, very small islands of solid which are floating in the liquid. That is the other phase. So now, to understand what happens to the rotational inertia, let's just we have to do a calculation. And this is again a calculation that basically addresses the following question. Let's say that you have a channel in your system which is blocked, and you have superfluidity along this channel, and then you rotate the whole system. Then what kind of rotational inertia you will see arising from the superfluidity, and how it depends on whether there is a block or there is not a block. So again, this is the calculation that one can do using superfluid hydrodynamics. One looks at a velocity field, and we put in the stream function to say that this del cross V is going to be equal to 0, and then put in also incompressibility. That gives me some kind of a Laplace equation. So we have to solve it with appropriate boundary conditions, which is dictated by the geometry. And then from that one can get the velocity field, from which one can get the angular momentum, and from that one can get the inertia, rotational inertia. So this is a very simple model calculation that we did around that time, which showed that, so there is this parameter. This parameter, which is basically there is two, we are looking at a ring, so there is an inner diameter and inner radius and outer radius, and the ratio between these two is a parameter which tells us about how the width compared with the diameter of this ring. So one can do this calculation for different values, and this is the parameter C. So C equals 1 basically corresponds to where the width is very small compared to the diameter. In that regime, the inertia of such a blocked ring is pretty much the same as what it had if there was no superfluidity. So the superfluidity does not lead to a reduction in the moment of inertia if it is in a channel which is blocked. It has to flow around the whole channel to be able to see the whole effect of superfluidity. So basically what one needs is to see an effect of on the moment of inertia, one needs this grain boundaries or whatever is causing the superfluidity to form closed paths, and for the effect to be basically macroscopic, one has to have these structures on a scale which is comparable with the system size. So these are the two things that one needs to have for this kind of a structure, superfluidity along this kind of a structure, to have an appreciable effect on the rotational inertia of the system. So then we looked at this pictures that we got from our work on the vortex problem, and there the parameter that we changed was the temperature. And this is at low temperatures where the melting near the grain boundaries occur in very, very small puddles. As we increase the temperature, these puddles become bigger. They tend to merge with each other, join with each other to form bigger structures. And eventually, as one goes to air temperature, which of course depends on many of the parameters that we put in the vortex problem, one begins to have this kind of closed loops, and loop size, at least in our finite system size, here is comparable with the whole system size, and so on. As we increase the temperature even further, these loops get bigger, and if we increase it even further, then the whole thing melts. So this is a pre-melting, and the melting is taking place preferentially along the grain boundaries, and the grain boundaries, because of that, the structures are becoming bigger and they're joining to form bigger structures. So if I want to look at, if I now calculate the rotational inertia for such a system as a function of temperature, then I'll get a picture that looks like this. So this is the picture. So these are temperatures, 17.8 to 18.4, and non-classical rotational inertia fraction, that and this is log scale, that jumps by several orders of magnitude, 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 1 or something like that, as one changes the temperature a little bit, going from high to temp. And this is not very different from what one observes in the experiments. I mean, although, I mean, as I said, the experiments do not really represent supersolid behavior, but this would say that if one had a system which is appropriately described by this model, and the things that enter into the model, of course, are the interactions between the particles, which is like the vortex-vortex interaction here. There are things like the masses which come from that line tension. All those things have to be taken into account. Then one would see that that system will show, as one changes appropriate parameter, will go from a situation where there is very little or almost no non-classical rotational inertia to a situation where there will be a substantial amount, although the fraction here is still few percent, and which is also what one found in the case of the experiments on helium. One has to understand increasing T in the vortex system, what it means for the boson system, because the mapping is such that temperature corresponds to the inverse temperature corresponds to the thickness of the system. So actually one cannot do experiments by changing the thickness, but one can all change the so I mean, one has to think about how one can actually cross this, one can simulate this in a system, and one way of doing that could be the increasing the pressure, etc. So some other parameter that you have in the bosonic system. Okay, so this is pretty much the one of the calculations that we did. Again, the conclusion is that if you have a system of bosons in 2 dimensions with appropriate interactions, then it will or should exhibit a phase which is polycrystalline, and then there are grain boundaries, and bosons near the grain boundary, they can become superfluid. So that system can show this non-classical rotational inertia if these superfluid channels, they form, join together and form closed structures of size comparable to the system size. Now, without going to detail, there were also, at the same time when people were debating about the existence of this supersolid, there were issues about what would happen if the defect line has motion, in the sense that here we are saying that near a defect line there will be superfluidity, and then what happens to the whole system. But these defect lines are not stationary. They can move. So there were some issues about that, and we tried to address one of those issues by some sort of a different model. I don't have enough time to go into all the details, but it's actually quite a simple model. This model was developed by these people called Dorsey, Goldbart, and Toner. And here the claim is that in the near a dislocation line, there is a coupling of the strain field of a dislocation to the superfluid order parameter, and as a result one could have superfluidity occurring near the core of a dislocation line. The question is, what happens when the dislocation line moves? And to understand that, we did a small calculation, or this student, Oriel student, did a small calculation, which is basically this Gross-Pertayevsky equation, where again you use basically the same coupling between the this Vxy. This is the coupling between the dislocation line and the superfluid field. The motion of the dislocation line is given by its position. Position is changing either in the y direction or in the x direction, and these two directions correspond to climb and glide motion of the dislocation lines. And what one found is that it doesn't have much of an effect, so it's kind of a negative calculation. This actually has some effect on the shape, on the distribution of the superfluid order parameter near the core of the dislocation line, but actually the strength of the order parameter near the dislocation line does not change as we make the velocity from 0 to some finite velocity. So I'll not go into details about that. So this is the conclusions that network of extended defects can lead to non-classical rotational inertia similar to that seen in experiments. A two-dimensional system of bosons which corresponds to this vortex system. For that we can show explicitly that this is what is going to happen. Then motion of the segments has little effect on the magnitude. It has some effect on the actual distribution of the superfluid order parameter surrounding a dislocation line. So this is where pretty much on time. Thanks a lot.
Time for one or two questions.
So I have a conceptual confusion here. You started with this model which was motivated by the vortices and this bitter decoration pattern where you have dislocations,
yes,
or rather lines.
Nice, yes.
If you believe in Larkinov-Chinnikov theory of collective pinning, then the ordered vortex lattice is the one which is very weakly pinned, and the disordered vortex lattice is where it gets much more strongly pinned, provided your columnar pinning are randomly placed. Which means that wherever you have this grain boundary, you have an amorphous, well-pinned vortex lattice. Why should that be a liquid? It's an amorphous solid which does not have a dynamics.
No. So the pinning centers are not sitting at the grain boundaries. Pinning centers are inside the vortex, inside the region.
I understand. The pinning centers are uniformly everywhere.
Yes.
So, however, when you have over a random pinning center, if you have an ordered vortex lattice, the collective pinning is very weak.
Yeah.
It is only when you relax the order that the pinning becomes stronger, and that is why the vortex lattice amorphizes.
Yes.
In the presence of pinning, normally the vortex lattice does not melt, it just amorphizes. So therefore your grain boundary regions will be regions which are very strongly pinned vortices.
But as you change temperature, if you look at the melting.
Why should that start there? That's my question.
It will start there because the structure around that is quite different from the structure that you have in the bulk. This is something that one sees in, let's say, colloidal systems and everywhere else.
But colloidal system doesn't have explicit pinning.
No.
There is a big confusion. Let's sort it out.
Okay, we can discuss later.
So, Tony, you want to ask a question? No. Okay. So,
Okay.
there is, I just want to indicate quickly, because I can't take time if I'm stopping others. Dislocation line, is there any connection with the optic in the dislocation lines seen in optics? Like Michael Berry has studied a lot dynamics of these dislocation lines. Are you familiar with
not
that?
a direct connection. These are just the topological defects that people have studied in crystalline materials for a long time.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's thank Professor Chandan Das Gupta for a very nice and illuminating talk. And our next speaker is my next teacher, Professor Arup Rai Chaudhary, and he is going to tell us something very close to my heart for last 10 years on glasses, not exactly two-level tunneling.